Hello, students, and welcome to our next Pneumatology lecture. Hope you're having a good week. And I hope you're learning a lot this semester, getting through your reading. I hope you're working on your papers and all your assignments. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at two different things. We're going to look at a patristic understanding of pneumatology, and we're going to do that by looking at a couple of the main arguments that the early church, when I say the early church, I mean post-apostolic age, this patristic age or age of the church fathers. So what were the main arguments that they used to make an argument for the Trinity? And the only real question, the question was not, is the Father divine or is the Son divine, but is the Spirit divine? And so that was the question that the early church needed to answer in order to really get an idea of the Trinity. So we're going to look at that, and then we're going to take a look at, just briefly, I'm going to introduce you to Montanism, which is an early church movement that has some implications for today. So let's jump right in and let's sort of back up a little bit. So when you think about the history of Christianity, you have the age of the apostles, and the last apostle to die was the Apostle John, the author of the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. So after the death of the Apostle John, the church entered what we call the Patristic Age, or the age of the church fathers. And so from the death of John, for the next 200 years, really 300 years, almost 300 years, the church continued to exist as an illegal religion in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire recognized the pantheon of gods, and they allowed some other religions to exist, like Judaism. Judaism could exist because it was the primary religion of the conquered Jews. But Christianity was different. As soon as the Roman government realized that Christianity was not just a sect of Judaism, it was considered an illegal religion. And so from the death of the disciple John, for the next couple of hundred years, the church really focused on apologies. The word apologia in Greek means to defend. So they were defending the faith against attacks. So the church focused on apologies. They focused on organizational structure. What does the leadership of the church look like in the absence of the apostles? So the next couple hundred years after the death of John, the church focused on that. And the third thing that they focused on was evangelism and discipleship. And so that all changed in 312 when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, and suddenly Christianity was no longer deemed an illegal religion, and the conversion of Constantine had an almost immediate impact on the Christian church. So almost overnight, things changed for the Christian church. Christianity was no longer an illegal religion, and all this time spent surviving. All this time that the church spent writing letters to leaders and influential people to defend Christianity, because Christians were seen as cannibals because they practiced the Lord's Supper. There was a misunderstanding of that. They didn't understand baptism. They didn't understand all these different things that the church was doing. Certainly didn't understand the resurrection. And so theologians throughout the ages have had to defend Christianity against some pretty serious and meaningful attacks based on misconceptions about what they believed. And so Christians have spent all this time defending the faith, and working out the doctrines of Christianity. Now they were a legal religion, and almost immediately their attention turned to handling various heresies and controversies that would arise. And the very first major heresy to be addressed by the church was Aryanism. Arian was a presbyter in the church at Alexandria, Egypt, that denied the dual nature of Jesus. And the issue was very divisive. It literally divided Christianity about half, even more than half. I would say that at some point there were more Christian leaders that followed the teachings of Arian than followed what would eventually become the Orthodox teaching. But the issue was so divisive that Constantine asked the bishops to convene and discuss the issue. The bishops met in 325 at Nicaea, and they decided that they debated the issue, and the bishops decided that the Orthodox view was that Jesus is divine. They issued the Nicene Creed, and so the church adopted the Nicene Creed. But what the Nicene Creed did not do was definitively answer the same questions about whether the Holy Spirit was divine and what the Spirit's relationship was with the Father and the Son. So between 325 moving forward, there were two people that were really instrumental in helping the church to formalize the doctrine that the Holy Spirit is divine. And those two people are Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea. So let's talk about Athanasius first, and let's talk about his arguments. And what you're going to see in these arguments is when it comes to the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, it's not that Christians can't defend that doctrine biblically. But the challenge with defending the doctrine of the Holy Spirit as divine is you have to make the case both theologically and rhetorically, or not rhetorically in that you say something and you mean something else, or but meaning rhetoric. You have to use philosophy to some extent. And so the arguments, it's natural that this was really one of the last formal major theological statements that the church had to wrestle with, because the church had always believed that the Holy Spirit was divine, but they'd never really adopted any formal statement on it. So Athanasius was key to that, and he was in the Arian controversy that produced the Nicene Creed. Athanasius was one of the chief proponents of the Orthodox view. He was actually the first person to formally offer up the 66 books of the canon that we use today. He's not the first to use the 66 books. Those 66 books that we have were the 66 books that the church was using, but he was the first to formalize it. But between 358 and 360, Athanasius shared some correspondence with an Egyptian monk. And this monk sought Athanasius's advice on how to respond to believers who acknowledged the deity of the Son, but not the Spirit. And so these letters between Athanasius and Serapion, which was the monk's name, is really the first major treatment of the Holy Spirit in the history of Christianity. So these letters are vital to understanding the logic that was used to develop this doctrine. So Athanasius really focuses on 6 different arguments. So here are the arguments that Athanasius focuses on to convince Serapion that, okay, this is the argument. He essentially said, Serapion, this is how you make the case for the deity of the Holy Spirit. So number 1 is revelation. Athanasius argued that the Spirit can only be known through the Son, but we can truly see the Son by being enlightened by the Spirit. Therefore, quote, Athanasius says, only he who is God and is co-substantial with him can thus impart knowledge of God himself. So Athanasius argued that only God can reveal God, and God is revealed through the Spirit. The Son is revealed through the Spirit, and only God can reveal God. The second part of his argument was related to creation and recreation. Athanasius said that the Father creates all things through the Word in the Spirit and also in recreation. So only divinity can create, and the Spirit was there at both creation and recreation, if you think about regeneration. The third element of Athanasius's argument was related to sanctification. He said that the Spirit receives his mission as sanctifier from the Son. And here's the point that Athanasius was trying to make, and I hope you get this. So Athanasius argued that the Spirit is involved in sanctification, but the Spirit does not partake in sanctification. Rather, Athanasius says, the Spirit is partaken of. So according to Athanasius, and this is a quote from one of his letters with Serapion, according to Athanasius, that which joins creation to the Word cannot belong to the creatures. And this is really an extension of his first argument that only divinity can reveal divinity. The fourth element of Athanasius's argument is related to mission, the mission of God. The Spirit, this is a quote, the Spirit bears the same relation to the Son as the Son to the Father. What the Spirit is in his mission from the Son, he is antecedently and eternally in himself in God. So antecedently, what he means there is that means to precede something in order of time. So now that you know the definition of antecedently, which is to precede something in order of time, we'll read that quote again. The Spirit bears the same relation to the Son as the Son to the Father. What the Spirit is in his mission from the Son, he is antecedently and eternally in himself in God. So it's about order, and it's about the order of divinity. The fifth argument that Athanasius makes is around the idea of perikeresis. So this refers to the relationship in the Godhead. So perikeresis is defined as co-indwelling and ontological unity. So you'll hear that term in theology quite a bit, ontos, which means being, ontologically. So you are ontologically human. You are in your very being a human. You're a human being, right? That is ontologically who you are. So when you talk about perikeresis, which is the relationship between the members of the Trinity, what Athanasius argues is that although one in essence, the individual members of the Trinity maintain their individuality without sacrificing divine unity. Now, that doesn't sound like a novel or a groundbreaking concept to us, because that's how we would explain the Trinity. But what I'm trying to point out here is that Athanasius was the first to make this argument. Athanasius says, quote, when the Spirit is in us, the Word also, who gives the Spirit, is in us, and in the Word is the Father. The Spirit then is united with the Father and the Son in a Trinity that is necessarily all creative, consistent, and in nature, indivisible, and in activity, one. So 5 arguments, not 6. I don't know why I kept saying 6. But so to kind of sum up Athanasius's argument is he says that he's arguing that a Christian's experience of being created, sustained, saved, sanctifies begins and ends in the eternal God who is Father, Son, and Spirit. So you can see there that what Athanasius is appealing to, and this was in the the second century, or the fourth century, the 300s. This is Athanasius is making this argument based on logically how you would conclude things based on the relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so that's Athanasius's argument. So Basil of Caesarea is another major voice in early Christianity. And again, this is helping you understand how the patristic fathers or the early church fathers viewed the Holy Spirit. And what you need to take from this is that what Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea, what they reflect is they reflect the Orthodox view. They don't reflect a minority view that became popular. What they are reflecting is they are reflecting the theology of the Christian church at the time. So they're just the first to really verbalize it. It's really similar to what I said about the 66 books of the Bible. The Christian church was using the 66 books of the Bible that we have today. There were a few canons that were offered up that were not those 66 books, but the church generally rejected those. And so when Athanasius put forward his formal canon of 66 books, there was no brouhaha, there was no parade, there was no debating. This was just the church saying, well, yeah, thanks for doing that, Athanasius, but that's our Bible. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here with these arguments about the Holy Spirit that Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea are making, is that they're making arguments that are being made, or at least we haven't discovered documents where these arguments are made prior to this. And so that's why we say that's why these are so important, because this is really the first time in Christian history that these arguments have been formally made, even though they were a part of Christian theology before Athanasius or Basil ever wrote. So what was Basil of Caesarea's contribution to early pneumatology? So in 364, Basil undertook an effort to refute an Arian heretic. And his efforts culminated in this pamphlet, this work that we have called On the Holy Spirit. It was written between 373 and 375. So Eustathius taught that the Spirit must not be ranked with the Father or Son because, quote, he is different in nature and inferior in dignity to them. So Eustathius taught that although the Spirit's status may be unique, he is not divine. Rather, he is created. Now, this was not an Orthodox view. So Basil, arguing with him, argued that the divine mission of God is key to understanding the unity and equality of the Godhead, including the Spirit. And then Basil divides his argument into three parts. So the first part of Basil's argument is this. Number one, the Spirit's ontological equality with the Father and the Son. Here's that word ontos again, ontological. So Basil argued based on the names given to the Spirit. Spirit of God, Spirit of truth, Holy Spirit, Spirit of Christ. He argues based on those names, and then he makes a connection between that and Jesus' words in John 15:26, that the Spirit emanates from the Father. So the language of John 15:26 implies that the Spirit shares the attributes of God, which are immutability, omnipotence, holiness, eternal, etc. So Basil is arguing based on the names given to the Spirit, coupled with what Jesus said about the Spirit emanating from the Father, and the language of 15:26 that implies that the Spirit shares those attributes. he also used the baptismal formula from Matthew 28:19 to make his ontological case. He said that Basil says that the Son and the Holy Spirit is to be ranked together with the Father. He argues that salvation involves each person, Father, Son, and Spirit. Otherwise, they would not be in the Matthew 28:19 baptismal formula. So that's the first part of his argument, this ontological equality with the Father and Son. Second part of Basil's argument is that the Spirit is inseparable in his operation with the Father and the Son in the economy of creation and salvation. So Basil argues that the Spirit does God's work and God is present through the Spirit's gift. Therefore, according to Basil, to sin against the Spirit is to sin against God. So Basil says, quote, in every operation, the Holy Spirit is indivisibly united with the Father and the Son. So what he's saying is that the Spirit's gifts, like if you can sin against the Spirit, that is to sin against God the Father, to sin against Jesus. So what he's connecting here is that the operation of the Spirit is divinely connected to the operation of the Father and the operation of the Son. So the operation of the Spirit then becomes the operation of the Trinity. And he, again, points to the baptismal formula, which is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he says that it's important that we note that the formula for baptism, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is not about rank. In other words, you shouldn't think Father, Son, and Holy Spirit 1, 2, and 3, but Father, Son, and Spirit 1, 1, and 1. Which, again, these are concepts that we get, that we may even explain these similarly, but this is the first time that we see these arguments in history. And then the third leg of Basil's argument that the Holy Spirit is divine is he talks about honor. He says that the Spirit is equal in honor with the Father and Son. And it's a very simple argument, but he argues that if the Holy Spirit cannot be separated from the Father and Son in his nature or activity, then he cannot be separated from the Father and Son in worship. He goes on to say that if you remain outside the Spirit, you cannot worship at all. And if you are in him, you cannot separate him from God. So what he's doing is he's saying is you can't worship God without the Spirit. You can't come to God without the Spirit. And so if you can't worship God without the Spirit, then you can't separate the Spirit from God. You have to say that the Spirit is an extension of the divine essence. And then the members in that divine essence are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So these letters circulated, they gained prominence, and the debate wasn't over, but these arguments sort of set the stage for what the church would eventually come to understand in the Second Council, held again at Nicaea in 381. They brought forth these arguments by Athanasius and Basil, and then others argued similarly. There were some arguments against it, but at the end of the day, the bishops decided in 381 to update the Nicene Creed to read, "And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and Son is worshiped together and glorified, who spoke by the prophets." So Athanasius and Basil were instrumental in helping the Christian church to get to that and formalize that doctrine, the doctrine that the Holy Spirit is God. And I want to point out a couple of things, or point out one thing in particular. If you typically read the King James Version of the Bible, there is a passage in 1 John where it says there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And these three are one. Your modern translations don't have that, because what we have discovered is that that passage was not, as far as we can tell, included in the original documents, but was added later as a Trinitarian statement. So for a really long time, people used that to make that Trinitarian statement, or to make a case for the Trinity. But it turns out that phrasing is not in, as far as we can tell, the original documents. They're not in the oldest documents that we have, and it looks like it was added later as a Trinitarian statement. All right, so that is essentially the foundational arguments that the early church used to support the Trinity. So moving on, I want to talk about a movement within early Christianity called Montanism. So we know that the early church was a charismatic community. We know that from reading Acts. We know that from reading the letters of early church fathers. And we know that the church was charismatic in the first few centuries following the death of the apostles. So the spiritual gifts of tongues, interpretations, prophecy, healing, those were all still in operation, and they were a normative part of the community. But in the second century, a man named Montanus began teaching that the Holy Spirit was giving new revelations to the church. Now, we refer to this movement as Montanism, but Montanus and his followers, along with other Christians, referred to it as the new prophecy. So Montanists were defined by the following. So these four things defined them. So number one was prophets. In the early days of the movement, two prophets were very active in the movement, both women, Priscilla and Maximilla. They were the movement was born and really thrived in Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. So it was defined by the presence of prophets. Number two, it was defined by ecstatic utterance and interpretation. So these were speaking in tongues, interpretations that were prophetic in nature. Third, this is the most defining feature of Montanism, is first-person interpretation of tongues. So when an interpretation would come, it was often preceded by, "I am the Lord your God." So if you were in a Montanist gathering and someone spoke in tongues, when another person interpreted, they would begin the interpretation by saying, quote, "I am the Lord your God," and then they would interpret. It was this first person interpretation that caused the greatest concern to other Christians. So that was probably the biggest feature, the most notable feature, because the other stuff, it didn't matter because the church was charismatic. So prophecy and speaking in tongues, none of that stuff mattered. But it was this first person interpretation that really caused some trouble. And then the fourth defining feature was asceticism. They're very ascetic. They would avoid marriage, take very harsh stances against sin. They would excommunicate members, fast for days, very ascetic. But there was a leader, a Christian leader in Africa, Tertullian. You've probably read about Tertullian, who defended the new prophecy. He argued that the prophecies were primarily about church discipline and Christian living. And according to Tertullian, Montanism was orthodox in their belief. So Montanism existed from the 2nd to about the 5th century, maybe longer. And church historians have not been kind at all to the movement. And there are very few documents that address Montanism during the height of the movement. Most of what we know comes after it and treats it very negatively, and in some consider it a heresy. So the reason I talk about Montanism is because there are a lot of similarities between Montanism and the modern Pentecostal movement. And so if you think about the modern Pentecostal movement, women have a very active role in leadership in modern Pentecostalism. Ecstatic utterance and interpretations obviously are a big part of it. Asceticism, fasting, Those things are more a part of Pentecostalism than they are other forms of Christianity. Strong church discipline in early Pentecostalism. They would turn people out of the church. That was the term they used, turn them out of the church. And then in a lot of Pentecostal and charismatic circles, first person interpretation is still an active component of the movement, meaning that someone speaks in tongues in the church, and when there's an interpretation, it's sometimes preceded with, I am the Lord your God. So this first person interpretation. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, okay, you have Montanism, which lasted from the 2nd to the 5th century, was sort of an outlier, finally died out, never was the predominant expression of Christianity. You have Montanism, and then 2,000 years later, beginning in the 20th century, you have Pentecostalism, which shares many of the same features of Montanism, but is now the predominant expression of Protestantism, the fastest growing movement in the history of Christianity, and the most influential movement in modern Christianity, and the only version of Christianity that's really growing. So how did Montanism die out, but Pentecostalism seems to be replacing mainstream Protestantism in almost every part of the country? And so that's a discussion for another day. That's something that may interest you to research that. And I'm not sure we have all the answers, but I think it's interesting. And it's certainly a topic within pneumatology that I think needs to be added to the things that we discuss. So that concludes the lecture. A little shorter today. I think we're at 30 minutes or so. I'm usually right at 40 minutes. So so I hope you got something out of this. Don't forget your reading. Don't forget your assignments. And as always, please call me or text me if you have a question. And thanks for showing up to the lecture.